A community is sent reeling for answers when a body is found on the city's south side.
I need police. The man looks dead.
Yeah, he's been here for a while.
The victim, not having pants on, tells investigators that it may have happened in the midst of having an intimate moment with somebody.
Fortunately, a network of friends come forward with tips.
This is the guy that I have a feeling did this. If you touch him, I will kill you.
But will it be enough to solve the case?
They received this phone call about a vehicle that was engulfed in flames.
Everything seemed normal until that doorbell rang.
The homeowner where the dead body is located, they're just working on getting all their camera footage together.
They can see the killer fleeing the home.
I don't want my family to think I'm a monster.
What 19-year-old is capable of this kind of carnage?
September 25th, 2021, San Antonio, Texas. It's a quiet Saturday morning in the Lone Star State's second largest city, a metropolis known for its rich history and vibrant culture.
San Antonio is filled with families, people looking to make a fresh start, people looking to start their career, and it's filled with so much culture, diversity, and inclusion.
On the city's peaceful south side, most residents are just waking up.
It's a relatively quiet area of San Antonio. It's definitely a family neighborhood area.
For one Southside woman, the day starts off with an ordinary drive dropping her husband off at work. But on the way back home, something disturbing catches her eye in a neighbor's yard.
She saw what appeared to be a body in a front lawn.
At first, the woman chalks it up to autumn festivities.
She's thinking maybe somebody's working on their Halloween decorations.
But the gory sight is too realistic to ignore.
She realizes, yeah, that's not a Halloween decoration. That's a body laying there.
When she realized that the person had blood on them, she could see an injury to the head, she knew that she needed to call 911.
San Antonio 911, do you need police, fire, or EMS?
I would say EMS, but I need police, but the man looks dead already.
Okay. We're getting police and EMS out there as soon as we can.
By the time officers reach the scene, emergency responders have already confirmed the bloodied man is deceased.
Yeah, he's been here for a while.
But despite the fact that there's a dead man on their doorstep, the shocked homeowners of the residence don't recognize him and have no idea how he got there.
The homeowners didn't know that the victim had collapsed right in front of their front porch. They heard all the fire trucks and all the commotion. Then they came out and, oh my God, there's a dead body.
So no relation. No relation. No relation. They don't know the guy.
Based on what officers see, they quickly understand that this deceased man has been stabbed and left for dead.
However, there's not enough blood around his body to account for the copious stab wounds.
Investigators suspect the man was actually killed elsewhere.
They looked for a blood trail or an indication of what had happened, where it happened.
Blood here. Blood. I wonder if that's a transfer from his hands, you know what I mean?
The blood trail leads officers to the house next door, the home of a man named Christopher Olivares.
The blood trail led all the way to the back door.
Hey, let's go to the front. Close that. Can you close the gate, brother? We're gonna go to the front.
While authorities are tracking the blood trail through Christopher's backyard, an officer at the front of the house makes another gruesome discovery.
Blood here.
It's immediately clear that something horrific happened inside the residence.
They notice large amounts of blood inside the open doorway. This lets them know, hey, this is where this individual probably came from.
They're able to confirm the homeowner, Christopher Olivares, is their deceased victim.
40-year-old Christopher Olivares was known across San Antonio for his outgoing, optimistic spirit.
Christopher is someone who is very comfortable in who he is. His friends say that he is the life of the party.
Chris was the type of person that would give you the shirt off of his back. He was somebody that was really, really giving.
His comfort as the center of attention started at a young age, when Chris developed a fascination with broadcast news.
When he was growing up, he would even act like he was a reporter and have this persona.
He would dress up as the weatherman, and he would do these impressions for his family.
After his graduation from McCollum High School in 1999, Chris turned his love of media into a career when he landed a job at a popular news station in San Antonio.
He decided to go behind the scenes as an account executive.
He was supporting local news stations through selling advertisements and commercials, which is the bread and butter for every TV station.
While his career took off, Chris didn't always have as much energy to devote to his personal life, but he still enjoyed dating.
He was proud of being a gay man. He would, date guys on apps, as many people do nowadays, using the apps to date and meet people. And so he had a fun life.
San Antonio really celebrates the LGBTQIA community. It's very, very open in terms of that culture.
But now, Chris Olivares has been found stabbed to death on his neighbor's front lawn. The victim of an attack so brutal, those same neighbors didn't even recognize him.
You would be surprised what death does to facial features. It's a very odd phenomenon. Of course they knew their next door neighbor, but couldn't recognize him in death.
As homicide detectives make their way to the scene, the responding officers finish clearing Christopher's home.
It's clear. Laundry room. There's what?
There's a drop of blood right there. It's all right, Poochie.
It's all right.
In the backyard, they find Christopher's boxer, Rocky, who is thankfully unscathed.
Police call the animal care team to the scene, and they take Rocky outside.
With the dog in safe hands, they turn to the carnage inside.
There was blood all over the kitchen, blood in the hallway, blood in the living room, and then there was a lot of blood in the bedroom.
That degree of violence immediately tells the officers one thing about whoever killed Christopher Olivares.
It is consistent with someone who has lost control, whether they are in some sort of a mental breakdown or they are completely and totally enraged.
Police determined this was personal.
Police in San Antonio, Texas have begun investigating the killing of 40-year-old TV executive Christopher Olivares. And despite finding his bloodied body on his neighbor's front lawn, it's clear to investigators the attack started inside Chris's residence.
It's a brutal scene inside. There are large amounts of blood all over the place. And for them, it sets the tone that this was personal for someone.
Homicide detectives arrive and review every grim detail of the evidence throughout the home.
There's going to be blood in the front room, kitchen, the back bedroom, which is like kind of the back left-hand corner of the house, along the bed and the floor, even along like a printer. So the blood is like kind of moving throughout the house.
Next, the detectives turn their attention to Chris's body.
Mr. Olivares was in full rigor mortis, which leads them to believe that he had been dead for several hours, and in all likelihood had probably been attacked sometime during the night.
They found multiple stab wounds to his head, the back of his head.
Investigators determined that Chris was stabbed 25 times.
The majority of the stab wounds were penetrating stab wounds, but they didn't cause any real damage that would have ended the life of the victim. There was only one out of those 25 strikes that was fatal.
Investigators also take special note of the fact that Chris is not wearing pants.
They have to wonder if there could be a sexual element to this crime.
There's so many questions when you find someone in that state of half dressed, half undressed.
Inside the home, detectives quickly locate what they suspect to be the murder weapon.
There's a kitchen knife that's covered in blood.
The knife appears to have come from a knife block on the kitchen counter.
The first thing that we're going to swab it for is DNA. And we're not just looking for the victim's DNA, we're also looking for the suspect's DNA.
As for the identity of Chris's killer, investigators don't find any obvious clues in the home, but they do notice something outside that may hold the answer.
Chris had surveillance cameras in and around his property. So the investigators were really hopeful that the footage would show who had done this to Chris.
I noticed that there's really good camera angles, which I think would pick it up.
But that went directly to his cell phone, and his cell phone was password protected.
That means police will have to contact the cell phone carrier before they'll be able to access those videos.
In order to get into somebody's phone, if you don't have a password, you've got to get a search warrant, a subpoena, and send it off to the cell phone carrier and hope that they get back to you in a timely manner. And it's on their timeline, not yours.
Luckily, though, Chris's next-door neighbors also have a security camera installed.
The homeowner where the dead body is located, they're just working on getting all their camera footage together.
When they review the video, police see Chris's white sedan drive off around 1:45 a.m.
And then just moments later, Chris comes from his own home into the neighbor's property and collapses.
Police cannot see who was inside of Chris's car, but one thing they know for sure is that that person stole his car to get away from the scene.
So now they're pretty sure this is the actor who committed the murder.
There's a killer on the loose.
Homicide detectives investigating the murder of television executive Christopher Olivares have just discovered that his neighbor's surveillance camera captured the killer fleeing the crime scene in Chris's white sedan.
With this new evidence, investigators issue a BOLO alert for Christopher's vehicle, and they broadcast it across all law enforcement within the area.
Meanwhile, word of the beloved San Antonian's murder spreads across the city.
Chris is a very popular guy, so as word spread throughout the community that he was murdered, people are devastated, they're heartbroken, they're shook, and they want to help in the investigation.
It takes a community to solve a murder, so friends start stepping up. They start providing leads and information.
One of the first people police speak with is a man who says he's been a close friend of Chris's for years.
This friend had actually spent time with Chris on the evening before he was killed.
You were with Chris last night.
I was with Chris yesterday. I left his house at 5:30.
But he reveals Chris was planning to have some other friends over later that night.
He told me he was gonna have a few more people come over and chill, and that's it.
Could one of them be capable of murder?
Detective 101 work would say that the last people to talk to the victim is the one that you're going to want to talk to.
Investigators quickly track down two more friends that went to Chris's that night, and they willingly come in for an interview.
They question the men separately and start by asking when they arrived at Chris's house.
We got there, and it was gonna be close to 10.
So about 10, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Who drove there?
I did.
According to the friends, they'd hung out with Chris in his bedroom for a couple of hours.
Everything seemed normal, pretty normal then, until we left. Like 20 minutes prior to we left is when that doorbell rang.
So somebody actually rang the doorbell.
Yes.
And where were y'all in the house when that happened?
We were, the bedroom that was right there. The doorbell rang, and that's when he fixed his phone.
Did he say anybody's coming over? Did he?
Yes, sir. He ignored it, like, they didn't touch to it. That was the weird part. We're like, who was it? So, like, it's the neighbors. Like, he made an excuse for it, like.
He said it's the neighbors?
It was like interference with the neighbors or something, with the cameras or something like that.
20 minutes later, the men decided to call it a night.
I was like, hey, well, we'll see you later.
Okay. And then, did he walk you out? Did you guys walk yourselves out? Or?
Basically, he kind of rushed us, kind of sort of rushed us to go.
Okay. Did he say he was going to go anywhere? Did he say anybody's coming over? Did he?
No, sir.
You didn't see anybody hanging out?
No.
Okay. And it says about 12 something you left? About 12 o'clock?
Yes.
Now investigators are wondering, who really rang Christopher's doorbell that night?
Could it be the person who killed him?
Was this a jilted lover situation? Was this someone that he met on a social media site that was a predator? So now you have all of these avenues that have become open to the investigators to start weeding out and weeding through.
But on September 28th, police receive a call that sends the investigation in another direction. This time about 30 miles east of San Antonio.
They receive this phone call about a vehicle that was engulfed in flames.
It's Chris Olivares' missing vehicle.
Police investigating the murder of 40-year-old Christopher Olivares are trying to identify a person friends say stopped by his house just hours before his murder.
Friends who were at Chris's that night say someone rang the doorbell around 11:40 p.m. But Chris ignored the doorbell and no one was outside when they left 20 minutes later.
Detectives suspect this visitor might be the same person who killed Chris and was then caught by a neighbor's camera fleeing in Chris's car. But before they can dig deeper into that lead, they get a call from their colleagues in nearby Guadalupe County.
They receive this phone call about a vehicle that was engulfed in flames.
It's Chris Olivares' missing vehicle.
Guadalupe County Sheriff's Office informs San Antonio police that Chris's stolen car has been found in a rural area of their jurisdiction.
They found Chris's car about 30 miles away from his home.
And any questions about whether or not the fire had been intentionally set are answered by the time responders get to the scene.
There was a red gas can behind the victim's vehicle. The person who arsoned the vehicle didn't even bother to throw the red gas can inside the car and light it on fire.
Unfortunately, though, any other evidence that could lead to the killer has been destroyed.
I think we can assume that the purpose or the intent of setting the car on fire was to destroy any evidence that was inside of it.
Back at the station, San Antonio investigators continue their hunt for more information and come upon something that piques their interest.
In speaking with more of Chris's friends, they learned that he had ended a long-term relationship earlier that year.
Chris was in a long-term relationship for about a year or so, and that ended about 6 months ago.
Detectives are eager to speak with Chris's ex, and on October 6th, they get their chance.
So just kind of go over your relationship with Chris and how you met Chris and how long y'all been friends and stuff like that.
Met about 2 years ago. That's when we started hanging out and getting to know each other. We ended up becoming a couple. We were together about a year, 4 months till we finally cut it off. And
how long ago was that?
That was back in February. I want to say late February.
Chris's ex describes the breakup as a mutual decision and says he and Chris had stayed on good terms, even seeing each other regularly.
Christopher's ex told investigators there was no bad blood and that they remained friends.
In fact, he saw Chris the day before he was killed.
Over there, it seemed like he was kind of, I mean, he was dressed up, so I didn't bombard him too much because I didn't realize that he was busy.
How long were you there?
I wasn't there, not even 20 minutes.
Okay.
As for his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Chris's ex says he was across town.
So Friday night, where were you at? And who were you with?
I was with my boyfriend.
Okay.
He tells investigators he was at his new boyfriend's house, and they are able to verify that alibi.
Chris's ex is shaping up to be more of an asset to the investigation than a suspect, especially when police ask him what he thinks happened to Chris.
Christopher's ex tells investigators he has a very strong feeling he knows who hurt Chris. He tells investigators about a man named Andre.
This is the guy that I have a feeling did this. And why I say that is just one time he was sitting in the back patio and he would not leave.
Chris's ex says Andre had a tendency to show up at Chris's house unannounced and demand money or rides from him.
He told Chris, he said, well, I need you to take me home then if you're not going to help me out, because he wanted money from Chris.
Investigators find out that Chris had a hard time telling Andre no, despite how horribly Andre treated Christopher. And that was the most beautiful part of Christopher's nature. He had a hard time telling the people he cared about no, but this led him to be taken advantage of.
Chris's ex says a couple of months ago, he witnessed a simple disagreement with Andre escalate to violence.
He tried hitting Chris's face, and my instincts just kicked in. I stepped in front of him. I was like, you're not going to do shit, bro. I was like, if you touch him, I was like, I will kill you, bro. It's right now.
When he's thinking of who would do this, that was the first person that came to mind because he witnessed that aggression and violence, but he didn't have any other information about this Andre person besides his first name.
This bothers the out of me, man, that somebody did this. And I just want justice. I want this bastard to be caught. And that's the only person I know who would want to do harm to him.
This ex-boyfriend was very adamant that, okay, this Andre guy has to be the suspect. This has to be the person who did it.
However, when police finally receive the footage from Chris's home security system, it will blow the case wide open.
They successfully downloaded footage from the night of the murder.
Once they get access to the footage from his cameras, there is a figure seen.
They can see Christopher's killer fleeing the home.
In the wake of Christopher Olivares' murder, San Antonio police have finally received the surveillance footage from his home security system.
They successfully downloaded footage from the night of the murder, and they can see Christopher's killer fleeing the home.
It's grainy, it's low light. You can tell it's a male. You can tell that they're relatively slim. You can tell they have on dark pants, but you can't really identify who this person is.
Could he be the mysterious Andre Chris's ex told them about?
Detectives bring Chris's ex back in for an interview to see if the man in the footage matches this Andre character. Because Chris's ex had done some detective work of his own, he was able to provide a picture of Andre that he tracked down from a dating app.
This morning I was just searching, going through to see if I could find a profile of that same guy when I found him this morning.
Okay.
So here are the photos. And the screenshots.
When detectives take a closer look at the photos, Andre doesn't appear to be a match for the man in the surveillance footage.
They realized rather quickly that the Andre guy is not the person who left the home the night of the murder and is not the person who they're looking for.
The person that's on the video, that's the person that did harm to Chris. And then if you find somebody that matches that profile, you've got my number. Just say it after that.
All right.
Thanks to the surveillance company, Detectives are able to obtain even more footage from the weeks leading up to Chris's murder.
So the detectives sit down and they just start pouring through all of the video that they were provided. And finally, they find someone who looks very, very similar to the shadowy figure they saw coming out of the house.
As they were scrubbing the video footage, they were able to actually see the potential suspect taking a phone call in Chris's backyard.
But who is he? When police share the footage with Chris's loved ones, they hit a dead end.
Nobody seemed to recognize this young man.
So detectives turn to the local news media and Crime Stoppers for help.
Local news stations are shocked to lose one of their own. They broadcast the new surveillance footage of Chris's suspected killer far and wide.
It doesn't have a very clear shot of the face of the person, but enough that they put it out to the news media, hoping that someone will recognize who that is, and they'll call in a tip.
A $5,000 reward was offered for any information leading to the arrest.
But investigators are still coming up empty-handed.
Weeks with no information turns into months with no break in the case.
Regardless, San Antonio police aren't giving up. As they continue their investigation, they finally receive the DNA results from the bloody knife found at the crime scene.
In this instance, they were actually able to develop two distinct profiles. One belonged to Christopher Olivares. The second profile is an unknown person.
It seems as though Chris's killer doesn't have any sort of history with San Antonio police because he's not coming up in their database. Even with the DNA results, this guy isn't easy to track down.
Police decide to up the reward to $17,000. That's when they get a break in the case.
San Antonio police receive a call from an individual who says he thinks he can identify the man in the video.
The tipster went to high school with the person in the surveillance footage, and he names him as Sebastian Hernandez.
But what's most shocking is the age of their new suspect.
Apparently, Sebastian is only 19 years old. What 19-year-old is capable of this kind of carnage?
Detectives don't waste any time making contact with Sebastian Hernandez.
He immediately is very cooperative. He volunteers to go into the station. He does an interview.
When detectives first lay eyes on the 19-year-old suspect, it's obvious that he resembles the man in the surveillance video.
Thanks for coming. And this is voluntary. I did ask you to come down here.
He was very polite and professional when he spoke with the police and was very helpful in terms of giving them the information that they needed.
He said his friends called him and said they saw him on TV.
Okay. Did you see these videos at all?
I did, but just because my dad sent me, and I was like, what the hell?
Yeah, what did your dad tell you?
Yeah, no, he was just worried because everybody kept thinking it was me.
And to the investigator's surprise, Sebastian admits that he is the individual in the video talking on his cell phone.
He did admit to it being him in the backyard. He said, actually, I was there.
So we know that Sebastian, on at least one occasion, has been inside that home.
But Sebastian claims he's not the shadowy figure who fled Chris's house on the night of the murder.
So have you seen the other videos?
Yeah, I've seen them, but they're definitely not me.
Okay.
As for his relationship with Chris, Sebastian claims they met a few months ago.
Sebastian explains to police that he met Chris through a mutual friend, that they hang out sometimes, but nothing more than that.
He says the day he was caught on video in the backyard was the last time he ever visited Chris's house.
Okay. So, how many times do you think you've been at Chris's house?
Probably just like twice at most.
Okay.
When detectives inquire into his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Sebastian tells the investigators he was hanging out at his apartment complex across town.
I was outside of my apartment.
He says he was hanging out with his neighbors.
What are their names? You know?
I don't know their names, but I don't know their nicknames.
Okay. What were their nicknames?
RC.
RC?
Yeah.
And he gives them initials. Here's the initials, no last name, no apartment number, nothing.
And rather than chase down his alibi, at the end of the interview, detectives tell Sebastian there's one way they can eliminate him as a suspect.
To help on the investigation, would you consent to provide some DNA?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Police tell Sebastian, let's just clear this all up, give us a DNA swab, and we'll be able to clear you from this. And surprisingly, Sebastian agrees.
Once the sample is collected, police send it out for testing at the crime lab and cut Sebastian loose.
Obviously, it takes a while for the results of the DNA sample to come back, and so they had no reason to hold him.
You can't just go off willy-nilly arresting people. You have to be ready for that case to be filed when you make that arrest.
However, when the DNA results finally come in, there's no question who killed Christopher Olivares.
Investigators finally get their answer on who else's DNA besides Christopher Olivares is on this murder weapon. It is Sebastian Hernandez.
This kid is only 19 and doesn't have any prior record. What possessed him to do this?
If he had simply not voluntarily gone in and consented to give his DNA, we'd be having a completely different conversation about what happened. But when people interact with police officers, right, they're an authority figure, you're in an interrogation room. Even though technically you're free to leave, it doesn't really feel that way. And so if this person is over you saying, hey, will you do this? You kind of revert to this sort of childlike mentality. Like when the adult asks you to do something, you do it. You know, and maybe that's the case with him, too.
After months of dedicated police work, San Antonio investigators working the murder of 40-year-old Christopher Olivares have zeroed in on an unlikely suspect, a 19-year-old young man named Sebastian Hernandez.
When police get the DNA results, it comes back as a match. Sebastian's DNA is found all over the murder weapon.
They arrest Sebastian, and then they bring him down to conduct another interview.
Once he's back in the hot seat, detectives deliver the news to Sebastian.
So last time you were here, I remember I asked you for your buccal swab, right?
Yes, sir.
So your DNA was found inside that home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? On a few items tied to the murder investigation, tied to the actual murder.
Mm-hmm.
Police explain to Sebastian why he is under arrest, and they give him one final opportunity to tell them exactly what happened. He is very reluctant at first, but he decides to tell them his side.
Sebastian says when he arrived at Chris's house on the night of September 25th, he thought it would just be one of their typical hangouts.
How'd you get there?
He picked me up, sir.
Okay.
Everything was cool. Once we got inside, like, I asked him if we could drink a little bit. And we drank like a beer, so I don't know.
So Sebastian tells police it started off very normal. He was hanging out with Chris, they were drinking and enjoying their time together.
But after hanging out a while, Sebastian says Chris's demeanor changed.
Basically, like, how do I probably put this? Like, this is why it's very hard for me to talk about.
I understand.
Cause he tried to touch me. Like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, he tried to touch me.
Sebastian Hernandez tells the detective how Christopher had become sexually aggressive and had actually began to try to grope him and assault him.
Sebastian claims he didn't even know that Christopher was gay until that moment.
He struck Christopher and then tried to leave.
That's when, according to Sebastian, Chris grabbed a kitchen knife.
He said that Christopher actually was the aggressor and tried to take a knife to harm him.
He tried to come at me, like tried to stab me in my back. I heard his footsteps, so I turned around in time. And I raised my hand like this, and the knife got me right here.
Okay.
That's my scar.
In trying to leave, Sebastian Hernandez claims he was able to wrestle the knife away from Christopher.
I just grabbed it from his hand, I grabbed his wrist, and I went like this. So I grabbed control of his arm, and I took it out of his hand, and I just blacked out. I promise you, that's the last thing I remember. I blacked out completely. The last thing I remember is I'm at home, in my bed.
He says he has no idea how many times he used the knife on Christopher. He has no idea what happened to his car. He's a complete blank.
So you're telling me you don't remember taking his car?
I really don't, sir. I'm just being honest, I really don't.
I blacked out from the murder. I blacked out getting in the victim's car and finding the victim's keys. I blacked out buying a gas can. I blacked out setting it on fire. And I blacked out getting home from Guadalupe County. I mean, are you kidding me? It's completely self-serving.
So why didn't you not come forward?
Because, it's hard, and plus, I don't want my family to think I'm a monster.
When he used that word monster, I kind of wonder if he doesn't now see himself that way after he stabbed the victim so many times. I kind of think maybe he thinks he might be a monster.
For the investigators, nothing about this crime looks like an act of self-defense.
Christopher was allegedly being aggressive towards him, and he was supposedly defending himself. Well, 25 stab wounds does not show self-defense.
Instead, they think Chris and Sebastian must have gotten into some sort of argument that night. And rather than walk away, Sebastian committed a brutal, senseless murder.
So, where does the rage come from behind that? I think it comes from finding out that I'm not the only one in your life when I thought I was.
Although Sebastian claimed he didn't know about Chris's sexuality, investigators suspect it was quite the opposite.
Investigators were able to confirm that Sebastian and Chris actually met on a dating app. If Sebastian and Chris were more than just friends, maybe he was upset that Chris had been spending time with other men earlier that night. Or maybe Sebastian did feel violated in some way. Unfortunately, we'll never have a clear motive in this case.
Despite being stabbed 25 times and the killer getting away in his car, he managed to make it out of his home and out of his yard and to the neighbor's front yard. Chris was really trying to fight to live, to get help. It's just unfortunate that he was not able to get that.
San Antonio police charged Sebastian Hernandez with Chris's murder. And instead of taking his chances in front of a jury, Sebastian decides to plead no contest to the charges against him.
Nolo contendere is what it's called. They're saying, I'm not going to admit that I did this. I'm not going to deny that I did this. What I will do is accept the punishment associated for what happened.
In this plea deal, he agreed to be sentenced by the judge and not by a jury.
Chris's loved ones pushed for the maximum sentence possible under the plea agreement. And that's exactly what the judge hands down.
The judge decides to sentence him to 32 years in prison for the death of Christopher.
Personally, I don't think that the sentence was enough for what this man did.
Depending on how he conducts himself, he'll be, in his mid-40s when he's eligible for parole? He could very well serve half of that 32-year sentence and still have enough of his life left that he could come out and be a productive member of society.
You know what's sad about the case is we'll never know exactly what happened.
You have Christopher, who was thriving. He was comfortable in his skin. He was a lot older, so a lot more mature, versus somebody who was just coming into his own and not really knowing how to maneuver around that.
This was just a horrible, horrible crime that took place that devastated the community and the two families that are involved.
His family has to live with the fact that they're never going to see him again for the rest of their lives. He was taken too soon.
In the early decades of the 20th century, something extraordinary happened in Oklahoma. Beneath the land of the Osage Nation lay immense reserves of oil. And when those reserves began producing wealth, the lives of the people who owned the land changed almost beyond recognition. Money flowed from beneath the ground. Families who had once lived ordinary lives suddenly possessed fortunes. The source of that wealth was not a bank, not a factory, and not a business built by human hands. It was the earth itself. But the same fortune that brought prosperity would eventually make members of the Osage Nation targets. Their wealth became visible. Their property became valuable. And in the years that followed, their deaths began to produce financial benefits for people outside their community. The mechanism behind this was the head right. Under the system, individual members of the Osage Nation were entitled to receive a share of the revenue generated by the mineral resources beneath their land. These rights could be inherited, and during the period in question, people who were not Osage could also acquire head rights through inheritance. That detail would become central to one of the most disturbing criminal conspiracies in American history. A person did not necessarily need to steal money directly. They could wait for the owner of a valuable head right to die. Then the right could pass to an heir. If that heir also became inconvenient, another death could follow. The process could continue until the wealth was concentrated in the hands of someone who had never belonged to the community that had originally possessed it. At first, however, the deaths did not appear to form a single story. Some were attributed to illness. Others appeared to be isolated crimes. There was no obvious connection between one death and another, no single crime scene that revealed the entire design. Yet the pattern would eventually become impossible to ignore. According to the information later gathered about the period, more than 60 Osage people died or disappeared under suspicious or unresolved circumstances between roughly 1920 and 1925. The number itself is difficult to comprehend. 60 lives. 60 families confronted with funerals, uncertainty, and questions that did not receive satisfactory answers. And behind those deaths was a disturbing possibility. Perhaps some of these people were not dying by chance. Perhaps they were being selected. Perhaps the reason was not who they were as individuals, but what they owned. At the center of this emerging nightmare was a man named William K. Hale. Hale had arrived in Oklahoma around 1902 in relatively poor circumstances. Over time, however, he transformed himself into one of the most influential men in Osage County. He became a ranch owner, businessman, and powerful local figure. He cultivated relationships with banks, stores, and people of influence. He presented himself as generous and friendly toward the Osage. He became known as the King of the Osage Hills, a title that reflected the position of authority he had built for himself. But behind that public image was a different picture. Hale was accused of using money, threats, bribery, and personal connections with local officials to maintain his influence. According to the later federal investigation, he was not simply a wealthy man living among the Osage. He was at the center of a network whose purpose was to obtain wealth and mineral rights through a series of deaths. The most important element of that network was not necessarily the act of killing itself. It was what came afterward. Every death could alter the path of inheritance. Every inheritance could change who controlled the money. And every change in ownership could create a new financial motive for another death. One family in particular would become central to the investigation: the family of Molly Kyle Burkhart. Molly was an Osage woman who possessed considerable wealth. She married Ernest Burkhart, the nephew of William Hale. That marriage would later become one of the most significant elements in the investigation. According to the information gathered by investigators, Hale had encouraged Ernest to marry Molly. The significance was not simply personal. If members of Molly's family died, their property and head rights could pass to surviving heirs. Ernest could therefore become a beneficiary, while Hale could potentially profit through his nephew. The terrible logic was simple. The more members of the family who disappeared, the closer the remaining wealth could move toward the people connected to Hale. In this sense, the alleged conspiracy did not begin with a single victim. It was aimed at an entire family, and the first deaths did not necessarily look like murders. One of the earliest deaths connected to the family was that of Minnie Kyle, Molly's sister. Minnie died in 1918 at approximately 27 years of age. Her death was described at the time as the result of an illness that caused her physical condition to deteriorate. For years, it was not treated as a murder. There was no immediate investigation that exposed a larger conspiracy. But later, as other members of the family died in increasingly suspicious circumstances, Minnie's death began to look different. It became part of a pattern. That pattern was especially frightening because not every death required a gun. Some victims could appear to have died from illness. Others could be killed through direct violence. The methods could change while the financial objective remained the same. Then, on May 24, 1921, the pattern became unmistakably violent. Anna Brown, one of Molly's sisters, was found dead in a ravine near Fairfax, Oklahoma. She had been shot in the back of the head. Anna possessed a valuable headright, and her death should have raised immediate questions. Yet the investigation did not quickly produce the answers that were needed. Money and influence were deeply intertwined within the community, and people who knew what was happening had reasons to remain silent. Fear became another barrier between the victims and justice. Later, the federal investigation identified Kelsey Morrison as someone who admitted participating in Anna's killing. Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother, was also connected to the case, and federal investigators believed the killing had been carried out under Hale's direction. Anna's death was followed only months later by another tragedy. In July 1921, Lizzie Q, the mother of Anna, Molly, and Rita, died. Once again, the death took on a different meaning when viewed beside the others. One daughter had died violently. Another family member had already died under suspicious circumstances. Now the mother was gone as well, and with each death, the structure of inheritance changed. What had once appeared to be separate tragedies increasingly resembled a financial chain. Someone died. A headright changed hands. The remaining relatives became more valuable and potentially more vulnerable. By the beginning of 1923, another name would enter the center of the investigation: Henry Rohn. On January 26, 1923, Rohn, an Osage man and relative of Molly's family, was shot and killed. He was found in his vehicle. But this death contained one detail that would later become critically important. William Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on Rohn. Suddenly, the financial motive was not merely theoretical. There was a documented financial interest connected directly to the death of a man who possessed an Osage headright. And because Rohn had been killed within territory under federal jurisdiction, his murder provided a legal foundation for federal authorities to become involved. But even then, the full extent of what was happening remained hidden. The deaths continued. The money continued to move. And the people closest to the victims were not necessarily the people who could be trusted. The most disturbing part of the story was no longer simply that Osage people were dying. It was the possibility that their deaths had been incorporated into a system in which marriage, inheritance, headrights, oil wealth, and murder were connected. What began beneath the ground as a source of prosperity had become, for some, a reason to look at another human being not as a mother, sister, wife, or friend, but as an asset waiting to be transferred. And as the deaths accumulated, one question became impossible to avoid. how many of these people had actually been murdered, and how many more would have to die before someone finally broke through the silence. The story of the Osage murders cannot be understood simply by counting the dead. Each name belonged to a family, and each death changed the lives of those who remained. To understand why the killings could continue for so long, it is necessary to understand the world in which the Osage people lived and the extraordinary transformation that oil had brought to their community. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Osage lands in Oklahoma became associated with immense underground reserves of oil. The discovery transformed the economic circumstances of many Osage families. Money began to flow from the mineral resources beneath their land, and members of the Osage Nation received shares of that revenue through a system known as headrights. A headright was more than a piece of paper or an abstract legal entitlement. It represented a continuing financial interest in the resources beneath the land. For people who possessed valuable headrights, the income could be enormous. Wealth changed the way some Osage families lived. It also changed the way outsiders looked at them. Suddenly, members of a community that had been subjected to discrimination and pressure could possess fortunes that many people around them could only imagine. But the source of that wealth created a dangerous vulnerability. The headrights could be inherited. During this period, people who were not Osage could acquire them through inheritance. That meant that marriage, family relationships, and death could become connected to the movement of immense amounts of money. A person who married an Osage individual might eventually become connected to the family's property. A relative who survived another relative might inherit a valuable interest. And when a person with a valuable headright died, someone else stood to gain. The system itself was not a murder weapon, but in the hands of people motivated by greed, it created an opportunity that could be exploited. The difference between an ordinary inheritance and what happened in Osage County was the presence of repeated suspicious deaths. One death could be explained, a second might still appear unrelated. A third could be dismissed as coincidence. But when members of the same family began dying under different and troubling circumstances, the question changed. Was this coincidence, or was someone deliberately removing people from the line of inheritance? The answer would eventually point toward a network surrounding William K. Hale. Hale had not begun his life as one of the most powerful men in the region. He arrived in Oklahoma around 1902 in relatively poor circumstances. Over time, however, he built wealth, influence, and a reputation that allowed him to move comfortably among people who possessed money and authority. He became a ranch owner and businessman and established relationships with banks, stores, and other influential figures. He cultivated the appearance of a generous and friendly man, including toward members of the Osage community. His reputation gave him something that money alone could not provide: trust. That trust would become important because the alleged scheme depended not only on violence, but also on access. Hale needed to know who possessed valuable property. He needed connections to people who could be influenced or persuaded. He needed individuals willing to carry out acts that he did not necessarily have to perform himself. And, according to the later federal investigation, he possessed the influence necessary to create an environment in which people were afraid to challenge him. This is where Molly Kyle Burkhart entered the center of the story. Molly was an Osage woman who possessed substantial wealth. Her marriage to Ernest Burkhart connected her directly to Hale because Ernest was Hale's nephew. On the surface, it was a family relationship, but investigators later saw something far more troubling in that connection. According to the information gathered in the case, Hale had encouraged Ernest to marry Molly. The significance of the marriage became clearer as members of Molly's family began to die. If her relatives disappeared, their property and headrights could pass to surviving heirs. Ernest could become one of those beneficiaries. Hale, in turn, could potentially benefit through his nephew. It was a structure in which family relationships became part of the financial calculation. Molly was not simply connected to Hale because she married his nephew. She was connected because the wealth surrounding her family could eventually move through that marriage. and that made the people around her increasingly important and increasingly dangerous. Before Anna Brown was found dead in 1921, there had already been another loss. Molly's sister, Minnie Kyle, died in 1918 at approximately 27 years of age. At the time, her death was attributed to an illness that caused her physical condition to deteriorate. There was no immediate recognition that her death might belong to something larger. That detail is important because the later pattern of killings was not always obvious at the moment. Each person died. A violent murder creates a crime scene. A body found with a gunshot wound demands questions. But an illness can create uncertainty. It can be accepted by relatives, physicians, officials, and the community without producing the same urgency. If a person dies from what appears to be a natural cause, the possibility of murder can disappear before anyone thinks to look for it. Later, when other members of Molly's family died, Minnie's death became more difficult to view as an isolated tragedy. The possibility emerged that some deaths may have been disguised as illness. The victims were not all killed in the same way, and that made the overall pattern harder to see. Then came Anna Brown. On May 24, 1921, Anna was found dead in a ravine near Fairfax, Oklahoma. Unlike a suspected illness, this death contained a clear sign of violence. Anna had been shot in the back of the head. She also possessed a valuable headright. Yet the existence of a violent death did not immediately produce the kind of investigation that would expose the larger conspiracy. The local environment surrounding the murders was shaped by money, influence, and fear. People who might have known something had reasons not to speak. Those who were willing to speak could place themselves in danger. And the more powerful Hale became, the more difficult it was for an ordinary person to challenge the story that surrounded each death. Later, federal investigators would identify Kelsey Morrison as a participant in Anna's killing. Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother, was also connected to the case. Investigators eventually believed that Anna's murder had been carried out under Hale's direction. But Anna's death did not end the pattern. Only a short time later, in July 1921, her mother, Lizzie Q, died. Lizzie was the mother of Anna, Molly, and Rita. Her death added another disturbing element to the growing sequence. A family was disappearing one person at a time. Each death changed the inheritance structure. Each death potentially increased the financial interests of those who remained. And each new death made the next one easier to explain as an unfortunate event rather than part of a deliberate plan. From the perspective of the eventual investigators, that was one of the most important characteristics of the case. The murders did not need to look like a single crime. They could appear as separate tragedies scattered across several years. The victims could die in different circumstances. The perpetrators could use different methods. The financial consequences, however, followed a consistent direction. Wealth moved through inheritance. Headrights passed from one person to another. And the people positioned to benefit remained close to the family. By the time the story reached 1923, the deaths were no longer isolated events that could easily be separated from one another. Henry Rohn, an Osage man and relative of Molly's family, was shot and killed on January 26, 1923. He was found in his vehicle. The murder itself was horrifying, but investigators would later discover a financial detail that made the case even more significant. William Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on Rohn. That meant there was a direct financial connection between Hale and the death of a man who possessed an Osage headright. It provided investigators with something concrete, a documented financial interest rather than merely a theory about inheritance. And because Rohn was killed in an area under federal jurisdiction, his death eventually provided a legal basis for federal authorities to become involved. But for the people living through these events, none of this would have been clear at the time. They were experiencing deaths one by one. A sister was gone. A mother was gone. Relatives disappeared. The explanations were incomplete. The people who should have been able to provide answers often could not, or would not. And somewhere beneath the grief was a financial system that quietly determined who would inherit. What remained? The most tragic aspect of the story is that the victims were forced to live inside that uncertainty. Wealth had changed their circumstances, but it could not protect them. In fact, their wealth may have been the reason they were being watched. Their head rights, once a source of security, had become objects of desire. Their family relationships, which should have represented protection and trust, had become part of an inheritance chain that others could manipulate. And as the deaths continued, the question facing the Osage community became more urgent. If someone was killing for the head rights, how far would they go to obtain them? The answer would become even more disturbing when the violence moved directly into the home of Rita Smith, and when the danger eventually came from Molly herself. By the time the deaths surrounding the Osage community began to form a recognizable pattern, William K. Hale had already established himself as a man of considerable influence in Osage County. His rise was striking. When he arrived in Oklahoma around 1902, he was relatively poor. Over the years, however, he became a wealthy ranch owner, a businessman, and a prominent local figure. He developed relationships with banks, stores, and people who held positions of influence. He also cultivated a public image that made him appear generous and friendly toward the Osage people. This image mattered. In a community where enormous wealth had suddenly become part of everyday life, relationships could be as valuable as money itself. Trust opened doors. Influence could silence questions. Familiarity could make suspicious behavior appear ordinary. Hale possessed all three. He became known as the King of the Osage Hills, a title that reflected the authority and reputation he had accumulated. To people who saw only his public identity, he could appear to be a successful businessman and respected member of the community. But the federal investigation would eventually present a very different picture. Investigators came to believe that Hale was at the center of a network designed to obtain Osage wealth through death and inheritance. The alleged conspiracy depended on something more complicated than a single act of violence. It depended on the movement of property from one person to another. The value of an Osage head right did not disappear when its owner died. Under the inheritance system, the right could pass to another person. That meant the death of one wealthy Osage could create an immediate financial opportunity for an heir. If several members of the same family died, the concentration of wealth could become even greater. This was the logic that investigators eventually saw behind the deaths. A person could be selected because of what they possessed, but the ultimate objective could involve the people who would inherit from them. In such a system, the victim and the beneficiary were connected even when they were separated by death. That connection became particularly important in the family of Molly Kyle Burkhart. Molly was an Osage woman with substantial wealth. She was also surrounded by relatives whose deaths would eventually become central to the investigation. Most importantly, she married Ernest Burkhart, the nephew of William Hale. On the surface, the marriage connected two families. But according to the information gathered by investigators, Hale had encouraged Ernest to marry Molly. That decision would later appear to have enormous financial significance. Ernest's relationship with Molly placed him close to her property and to the wealth associated with her family. If members of Molly's family died, their head rights could pass to surviving heirs. Ernest could potentially benefit from that process. Hale, in turn, could potentially benefit through his nephew. The alleged scheme, therefore, depended upon a chain of relationships. Hale was connected to Ernest. Ernest was married to Molly. Molly was connected to a family possessing valuable head rights. And the deaths of family members could change who ultimately controlled that wealth. It was a structure in which the most dangerous person might not be standing beside the victim at the moment of death. The person directing the process could remain several steps away. The person carrying out the violence could be someone else entirely. And the financial reward could arrive only after the victim was gone. This distance between planning, violence, and profit would make the conspiracy difficult to expose. It also meant that the family could be surrounded by danger without immediately understanding where that danger was coming from. Molly's family had already experienced loss before the most violent phase of the murders became visible. Her sister Minnie Kyle died in 1918 at approximately 27 years of age. At the time, her death was attributed to an illness that caused her physical condition to deteriorate. There was no immediate determination that she had been murdered. That fact would become more troubling later, when other members of the family died in circumstances that appeared increasingly difficult to explain. In retrospect, Minnie represented one of the earliest pieces of a pattern. But patterns are rarely visible when people are living through them. For a family experiencing grief, one death can seem like a terrible but isolated event. A second death may still be explained away. It is only after several lives have been lost that the possibility of design begins to emerge. The deaths of Anna Brown and Lizzie Q would make that possibility harder to dismiss. Anna, Molly's sister, was found dead in a ravine near Fairfax on May 24, 1921. She had been shot in the back of the head. Anna also possessed a valuable headright. Later federal investigators connected the killing to Kelsey Morrison and Brian Burkhart and believed it had been carried out under Hale's direction. Only months later, in July 1921, Lizzie Q, the mother of Anna, Molly, and Rita, died. Once again, the inheritance structure became significant. When one member of a family died, property could pass to surviving heirs. When several members died, the potential beneficiaries changed again. The process created a disturbing mathematical logic beneath the human tragedy. The fewer people remained, the greater the concentration of the wealth could become. For the people inside the family, however, this was not simply a matter of numbers. These were mothers, daughters, sisters, and relatives. The financial consequences of their deaths existed alongside grief, uncertainty, and fear. The alleged conspirators, according to the later investigation, viewed the same deaths differently. They were not simply losses. They were steps toward ownership. The contrast is essential to understanding the horror of the case. The victims were human beings whose lives were being destroyed, while the people seeking to benefit from their deaths could treat those lives as obstacles between themselves and money. Hale's influence made the situation even more difficult. According to the information gathered by investigators, he used money, threats, bribery, and relationships with local officials to maintain his power. This created an environment in which challenging him could be dangerous. People who knew something might hesitate to speak. Witnesses could fear consequences. Suspicious deaths could remain unexplained because the people capable of investigating them were operating within a community where powerful relationships mattered. The result was a growing wall between the victims and justice. The murders did not need to be committed in one place or by one person. They could happen at different times and through different methods. Some deaths could appear connected to illness. Others were unmistakably violent. The variety itself helped conceal the larger design. But the financial destination remained consistent. Wealth moved through inheritance. By January 1923, another death would reveal an even more direct connection between murder and money. Henry Rohn, an Osage man and relative of Molly's family, was shot and killed on January 26th. He was found in his vehicle. The killing was significant not only because of the violence involved, but because William Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on Rohn. For investigators, that detail was difficult to ignore. Here was a powerful man with a documented financial interest connected to the death of an Osage man. Rohn's murder also occurred in territory under federal jurisdiction, giving federal authorities a legal basis to become involved. But even this was not the end of the danger surrounding Molly's family. In March 1923, her sister Rita Smith, her husband William Bill Smith, and their housekeeper Nettie Brookshire would die when a bomb destroyed their home. Molly and her son were not present and survived. Rita, like other members of the family, possessed a headright. The deaths were no longer simply a series of unexplained illnesses and isolated shootings. The violence had reached inside a family home, and with every death, the inheritance structure shifted again. The alleged conspiracy was becoming clearer, but the person at its center remained protected by distance, reputation, and influence. William Hale did not need to appear at every crime scene. If the investigators were correct, his power came from arranging circumstances in which other people could carry out the violence while he remained behind the scenes. Ernest Burkhardt occupied a particularly troubling position within that structure. He was Hale's nephew, but he was also Molly's husband. He was therefore connected simultaneously to the alleged planner and to one of the principal families whose wealth was at stake. As the deaths accumulated, that position would become increasingly impossible to ignore. And eventually, the danger would move beyond Molly's sisters and relatives. Molly herself would begin to experience unexplained health problems. The woman whose marriage had helped place her at the center of the inheritance chain would discover that she might not simply be living among the survivors. She might be the next target. By the spring of 1923, the deaths surrounding Molly Kyle Burkhardt's family had become impossible to view as a series of ordinary tragedies. Minnie Kyle had died years earlier after an illness that was not initially treated as suspicious. Anna Brown had been found shot in the back of the head in a ravine near Fairfax. Lizzie Q, the mother of Anna, Molly, and Rita, had died only months later. Then in January, Henry Roan had been shot and killed in his vehicle, with one particularly troubling financial detail attached to his death. William K. Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on him. Each death altered the inheritance picture. Each death potentially moved valuable property closer to the people connected to Hale. But the next killing would make the violence impossible to overlook. In March 1923, the home of Rita Smith became the scene of one of the most devastating attacks in the entire sequence. Rita was Molly's sister. She lived with her husband, William Bill Smith. Their home should have represented the most ordinary kind of safety, a private place where a family could live away from the dangers of the outside world. Instead, a bomb was placed there. When it exploded, the house was destroyed and 3 people died. Rita Smith was killed. Her husband, William Bill Smith, was killed with her. Their housekeeper, Nettie Brookshire, also lost her life. The destruction was not confined to one individual. It erased an entire household. Molly and her son were not present, and that absence saved their lives. But the emotional consequences were impossible to separate from the wider pattern. Rita possessed a valuable right. Her death, therefore, had financial consequences that went far beyond the immediate destruction of the home. Once again, the question was not only who had died, but who would receive what the victim left behind. The alleged conspiracy was beginning to look less like a collection of separate crimes and more like a process. People connected to valuable head rights were disappearing. Their deaths changed the distribution of wealth, and the people who stood to benefit remained connected to the family through inheritance and marriage. For Molly, the loss must have been devastating. She had already watched members of her family disappear. Now her sister had been killed in a bombing that destroyed the place where she lived. The manner of death was radically different from the illness associated with Minnie or the shooting that killed Anna and Henry Roan. But beneath those differences was a disturbing similarity. Money remained connected to the deaths. The headright system gave each loss an economic consequence. That consequence would become increasingly important as investigators later reconstructed the sequence. The bombing also demonstrated how far the alleged perpetrators were willing to go. A person could be killed in isolation, away from witnesses. A person could die in circumstances that appeared to be illness. But an entire home could also be destroyed. The violence could enter a private space without warning, killing not only the intended target, but other people nearby. Nettie Brookshire was not the person whose headright created the financial motive. Yet she died alongside Rita and Bill. Her death demonstrated the indiscriminate human cost of the attack. For those left behind, the question could not have been merely financial. It was a question of safety. If someone was willing to destroy a house to kill one person, then where could anyone feel protected? And if the people responsible remained unidentified or protected by influence, whom could the victims trust? This fear was one of the reasons the investigation later became so difficult. According to the information gathered by federal investigators, Hale possessed significant influence in the area. He had built relationships with businesses, banks, and local officials. He had money, reputation, and connections. People who knew something could be afraid to speak. Others could be influenced or threatened. Suspicious deaths could remain unexplained because the surrounding environment discouraged people from challenging powerful figures. For Molly, however, the danger was becoming more personal. She was not simply a surviving relative watching the inheritance of her family change. She was herself connected to valuable property. More importantly, she was married to Ernest Burkhart, Hale's nephew. If Molly died, Ernest would occupy a position that could allow him to benefit from the wealth surrounding her. According to the later investigation, Hale had encouraged Ernest to marry Molly, and the financial implications of that marriage became increasingly significant as members of her family died. The alleged logic of the conspiracy was therefore moving toward its most dangerous point. Molly had survived the deaths of her relatives, but survival itself could make her more valuable. If her family's wealth was moving toward her, then her death could cause it to move again. This was the central horror of the inheritance system when combined with deliberate murder. A person could become more vulnerable precisely because they were one of the last people left alive. The fewer relatives remained, the greater the concentration of property became. And the greater the concentration became, the greater the potential reward for anyone positioned to inherit it. By this stage, Molly began experiencing health problems that caused her to suspect she was being poisoned. Her physical condition became another source of fear. Illness had already been associated with earlier deaths in the family. Now Molly herself was experiencing symptoms that made the earlier events impossible to forget. Was she becoming ill naturally, or was someone trying to make her disappear? According to the results of the later investigation, Ernest Burkhart had been encouraged by Hale to participate in a plan to poison Molly. The attempt did not succeed. Some accounts in the information provided describe Molly being given drinks containing poison, while doctors were also suspected of helping conceal or support the plan. These allegations added another layer to the case because they suggested that the threat surrounding Molly was not necessarily coming from a stranger. It could be coming from someone inside her own circle. Her husband was the nephew of the man investigators would eventually identify as the central figure. In the conspiracy, the people closest to her were therefore connected to the very inheritance structure that made her vulnerable. This created a terrible contradiction. Family should have represented protection. Marriage should have represented trust. Instead, the relationships around Molly could also provide access to her property and daily life. The alleged poisoning attempt was different from the bombing at Rita's house, but it served the same financial objective. The methods could change. The desired outcome did not. Molly's death would potentially allow Ernest to inherit, and Hale could potentially benefit through Ernest. The danger was therefore not simply physical. It was embedded in the structure of her family relationships. At the same time, the larger community remained trapped behind what federal investigators would later encounter as a wall of fear. There were many suspicious deaths, but there was no immediate explanation that connected them all. There were people who knew pieces of the story, but knowing a piece was not the same as being able to prove the entire conspiracy. A person might know who had threatened someone without knowing who ordered a killing. Another might know that money changed hands without understanding why. Someone else might suspect a death was unnatural but lack evidence to challenge the official explanation. And when the suspected central figure possessed influence, every potential witness had another reason to remain silent. The deaths of Anna, Lizzie, Henry, Rita, Bill, and Nettie had created a trail of grief. But that trail did not yet lead directly into a courtroom. The evidence existed in fragments. The inheritance records suggested motive. The relationships suggested access. The deaths suggested a pattern. But a criminal prosecution required more. Investigators needed to establish not only that people had died, but that someone had deliberately caused those deaths and that the people at the center of the suspected network could be connected to the crimes. The federal government would eventually take on that task. But before that happened, the Osage community had to endure a period in which fear and uncertainty were stronger than the available protection. By 1925 and 1926, the situation had become serious enough that the Osage Nation's leadership sought federal intervention. The Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, would begin examining the deaths. Their approach would be different from the earlier efforts. Instead of simply asking questions openly, investigators would operate in secret. They would try to enter the community without revealing their true purpose. They would follow the financial connections and personal relationships that surrounded the victims. And they would eventually focus on the people closest to the alleged conspiracy. But for the moment, the story remained centered on one woman who had lost much of her family and had reason to fear that she might be next. Molly had survived while others died. Her survival had not made her safe. It may have made her more important. Her husband stood within the chain of inheritance. Her uncle-in-law, William Hale, stood at the center of the suspected network. And somewhere behind the deaths, the money and the silence was a question that the federal investigators would soon have to answer. Who was giving the orders, and how many people were willing to carry them out? By 1925, the deaths surrounding the Osage community could no longer be dismissed as a collection of unrelated tragedies. Too many people had died. Too many families had been damaged. Too many valuable head rights had changed hands after those deaths. And behind the grief was a growing suspicion that someone had deliberately turned the inheritance system into a source of profit. Yet suspicion was not enough. The authorities needed evidence, and obtaining that evidence would prove extraordinarily difficult. The problem was not simply that the killings had happened over several years. It was that the people who might know the truth were living in an environment shaped by money, influence, fear, and silence. William K. Hale had become a powerful figure in Osage County. He had money, business connections, relationships with banks and stores, and influence within the local community. He had also cultivated an image of generosity and friendliness toward the Osage. That public reputation created another obstacle for anyone who tried to accuse him. A man who appeared respectable to the community could be difficult to connect to crimes occurring behind closed doors. The deaths themselves had also occurred under different circumstances. Minnie Kyle had died in 1918 after an illness that was not initially treated as suspicious. Anna Brown had been shot in the back of the head. Lizzie Q had died in July 1921. Henry Roan was shot and killed in his vehicle in January 1923. Rita Smith, William Bill Smith, and Nettie Brookshire were killed when a bomb destroyed Rita and Bill's home. Molly Burkhart had later experienced health problems that caused her to suspect poisoning. To an investigator looking at only one case, these events could appear unrelated. But when they were placed beside the inheritance records and family relationships, another picture began to emerge. The deaths had financial consequences. Valuable head rights were transferred through inheritance. People connected to Molly's family could potentially benefit. Ernest Burkhart, Molly's husband, was the nephew of Hale, and Hale himself had a financial connection to Henry Roan through a $25,000 life insurance policy. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but fitting pieces together is not the same as proving a conspiracy. The Osage community had reached a point where local efforts were not producing the answers people needed. The number of suspicious deaths had become overwhelming. Yet the suspected network remained protected by the very conditions that had allowed it to operate. People were frightened. Some witnesses were afraid of retaliation. Others could be influenced through money or personal relationships. According to the information gathered later by federal investigators, some people who attempted to bring attention to the deaths also died under suspicious circumstances. That possibility created an atmosphere in which silence could seem safer than speaking. Imagine knowing something about a murder, but not knowing whether the person responsible had enough power to reach you. Imagine watching relatives die and realizing that the person who might benefit from their deaths was still living nearby, still conducting business, still appearing respectable. In such an environment, the absence of testimony did not necessarily mean the absence of knowledge. It could mean that fear had become stronger than the desire to speak. This was the wall federal investigators eventually had to confront. By 1925 and 1926, the Osage Nation's leadership sought federal intervention. The request reflected the seriousness of the situation. The community was no longer simply asking why individual people had died. It was demanding that someone investigate whether the deaths were connected and whether powerful people were responsible. The Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, took up the case. But the investigators understood that an ordinary investigation might not be enough. If agents openly arrived in the community and announced that they were investigating William Hale and the people around him, the suspected network could simply close itself off. Witnesses might disappear from reach. Evidence might be destroyed. People who were willing to talk privately might refuse to speak publicly. The investigators therefore needed another approach. The solution was secrecy. Tom White led the investigation and organized a group of agents who would operate undercover. Instead of arriving openly as federal investigators, they would enter the community under different identities and occupations. Some worked as insurance agents. Others posed as cattle buyers. Others presented themselves as oil prospectors. Some even approached the community as doctors or medical practitioners. The purpose was not to create a dramatic disguise for its own sake. The purpose was access. Investigators needed to speak with people who might reveal information without allowing Hale or his associates to understand what the agents were actually looking for. The undercover strategy changed the nature of the investigation. Rather than standing outside the community and demanding answers, investigators tried to become part of its surroundings. They could listen. They could ask questions that appeared ordinary. They could follow relationships and financial connections without immediately revealing that those connections were being examined as evidence. The central challenge was to discover how the individual deaths were connected. If Anna Brown had been killed because of her headright, who benefited? If Rita Smith died in a bombing, who gained from her death? If Henry Roan was murdered and Hale had taken out a life insurance policy on him, what did that mean? And if Molly Burkhart herself was becoming ill under suspicious circumstances, what would happen to her property if she died? These questions pointed repeatedly toward the same circle of people. Hale remained an important figure, but the investigators also had to understand Ernest Burkhart's role. Ernest was not simply a distant associate. He was Hale's nephew and Molly's husband. That placed him directly inside the family whose wealth appeared to be at the center of the suspected scheme. If the investigators could establish what Ernest knew, they might be able to understand what Hale had planned. Ernest represented a particularly important connection because he stood between two sides of the story. On one side was William Hale, the powerful uncle who was suspected of directing the conspiracy. On the other was Molly, the woman whose family had suffered repeated deaths and who herself had become a possible target. Ernest belonged to both worlds. That made him potentially valuable as a witness, but it also made him difficult to approach. Any admission could implicate not only his uncle, but himself. The federal investigators, therefore, had to build the case carefully. The goal was not merely to persuade someone that Hale was suspicious. They needed information that could connect people, motives, and actions. They needed to understand the role of John Ramsey, who was later identified as being directly involved in killings including Henry Roan and members of the Smith family. They needed to examine the involvement of Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother, who was connected to the killing of Anna Brown. They needed to understand Kelsey Morrison's admission that he had participated in Anna's murder. Most importantly, they needed to establish the relationship between these individuals and Hale. Each piece of information could become another link in the chain. The investigation, therefore, moved slowly, through people rather than through a single decisive discovery. Every conversation had potential significance. Every relationship could reveal another connection. Every financial transaction could help explain motive. And every death could provide another clue about the intended destination of the inheritance. What made the case particularly difficult was that the investigators were not dealing with a single crime scene. The evidence was scattered across years and across different forms of death. The case existed partly in financial records, partly in family relationships, partly in witness testimony, and partly in the circumstances surrounding individual killings. It was a puzzle in which some pieces had been missing for years. But the undercover investigation began to close the distance between suspicion and evidence. Eventually, the investigators focused increasingly on Ernest Burkhart. His position within the family made him impossible to ignore. He was the husband of Molly, the nephew of Hale, and someone who could potentially benefit from the deaths of people connected to Molly's inheritance. If the investigators could get Ernest to speak honestly, they might finally be able to move beyond the pattern of suspicious deaths and identify the people behind it. The pressure surrounding Ernest would soon become intense. He had a choice between protecting the family relationship that connected him to Hale and revealing information that could expose his uncle. That decision would become one of the most important turning points in the entire investigation. The federal agents had spent years trying to break through a wall of fear. Now they had reached a man standing on the inside of that wall. And if Ernest Burkhart decided to speak, the story of the Osage murders would begin to change from a collection of unanswered deaths into a case that could finally be taken into court. By the time the federal investigation began to focus seriously on Ernest Burkhart, the case had already accumulated years of death, suspicion, and unanswered questions. The Osage community had seen valuable members die under circumstances that were difficult to explain, while their headrights passed through inheritance. The pattern had become increasingly disturbing. A person died, property changed hands, and someone connected to the surviving family could potentially benefit. Yet William K. Hale remained difficult to reach. He was too powerful to be approached as an ordinary suspect, and the people around him were bound together by family relationships, money, and fear. The investigators therefore needed someone who stood close enough to Hale to know what was happening, but who might also be vulnerable enough to reveal it. That person was Ernest Burkhart. Ernest occupied an extraordinary position within the story. He was William Hale's nephew, but he was also the husband of Molly Kyle Burkhart, an Osage woman whose family had suffered a succession of deaths. Through his marriage, Ernest was connected directly to the very wealth that appeared to be at the center of the suspected conspiracy. His position made him both a potential participant and a potentially crucial witness. For investigators, understanding Ernest meant understanding the structure of the alleged scheme itself. If Hale was the person directing events, who carried out his instructions? If John Ramsey was one of the men willing to commit murder, what connected Ramsey to Hale? And where did Ernest fit between them? The answers would eventually come through Ernest himself. But getting those answers was not simple. Ernest was not an outside observer who could describe the crimes without consequences. If he admitted what he knew, he would expose his own involvement. He would also place his uncle in serious danger of prosecution. And his confession could affect the life of Molly, the woman to whom he was married. The emotional and personal pressure surrounding him was therefore enormous. The federal agents had to break through more than silence. They had to overcome loyalty, fear, and self-preservation. As the investigators reconstructed the deaths, the connection surrounding Ernest became increasingly significant. Anna Brown had been murdered in 1921, shot in the back of the head, and left dead in a ravine near Fairfax. Later investigators identified Kelsey Morrison as a participant who admitted involvement, while Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother, was also connected to the killing. Federal investigators believed that the murder had been carried out under Hale's direction. Then came the death of Henry Rohn in January 1923. Rohn was shot and killed in his vehicle, and Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on him. That detail gave investigators a concrete financial connection. Then, in March 1923, Rita Smith, her husband William Bill Smith, and their housekeeper Nettie Brookshire were killed when a bomb destroyed the Smith home. Rita possessed a valuable right. The deaths continued to change the inheritance structure surrounding Molly's family. By this point, investigators had reason to believe that the violence was not random. But a belief was not enough to bring Hale into court. They needed testimony capable of connecting the suspected organizer to the people who carried out the killings. Ernest was positioned to provide exactly that. According to the federal investigation, Hale had encouraged Ernest to marry Molly. The marriage placed Ernest in a position to benefit from the inheritance of members of Molly's family. If those relatives died, their head rights could eventually move toward surviving heirs. If Molly herself died, Ernest could become even more directly connected to her property. The alleged financial logic was therefore deeply intertwined with the marriage. Ernest was not simply married to one of the victims. He was married to a woman whose death could potentially change the ownership of a fortune. And the closer investigators looked, the more troubling his position became. Molly herself had begun to experience health problems and suspected that she was being poisoned. According to the later investigation, Ernest had been encouraged by Hale to participate in an attempt to poison her. The attempt failed, but the fact that Molly had become a possible target demonstrated how far the alleged plan could extend. She had survived the deaths of her relatives, but her survival did not necessarily make her safe. If anything, it made her more important within the inheritance chain. Ernest was therefore connected to both the victim and the suspected planner at the same time. He was the husband of a woman who had reason to fear for her life, and the nephew of the man whom investigators believed was responsible for the larger scheme. That contradiction became central to the investigation. As federal agents questioned people and assembled evidence, Ernest became what could be described as the weak link in the network. He did not possess Hale's wealth or influence. He did not have the reputation that Hale had built, and he was increasingly confronted with the consequences of what had happened around him. The deaths were no longer abstract events. They were people connected to his wife. They were members of her family, and the alleged financial benefits of their deaths were moving through relationships that included him. Eventually, Ernest began to provide information to investigators. His statements became one of the most important developments in the case because they helped connect Hale to John Ramsey and other participants. The investigation could now begin to move beyond circumstantial patterns. Investigators had been able to identify motives and financial interests. They had examined relationships. They had followed the sequence of deaths. But Ernest could provide a direct connection between the people involved. He could explain what investigators could not learn from records alone. He could describe the role of his uncle and the involvement of others in the conspiracy. Yet the moment Ernest began cooperating, the pressure on him intensified. His testimony threatened to destroy the position Hale had built for himself. A prosecution based on Ernest's statements could expose the man who had presented himself as the king of the Osage Hills and connect him to murder. That meant Ernest's cooperation was not merely a personal decision. It was a threat to the entire structure of protection surrounding Hale. The case would eventually demonstrate just how strong that pressure could become. When Ernest was preparing to testify, he was subjected to circumstances that caused him to change his position. According to the federal investigation, Ernest was taken from the court to Hale's ranch while the defense was attempting to influence him. The following day, Ernest appeared and withdrew part of what he had previously told investigators. For the prosecution, this was a serious setback. A witness who had appeared ready to expose the conspiracy was now retreating from his statements. It also demonstrated the difficulty of prosecuting Hale. Even after the federal investigation had uncovered important evidence, Hale's influence had not simply disappeared. The suspected organizer still had the ability to exert pressure on the people around him. Ernest's change of story could have weakened the entire case, but it did not end the investigation. Eventually, Ernest changed his decision again. He accepted responsibility for his role and acknowledged involvement in the conspiracy, including the bombing that killed Rita and Bill Smith. He then agreed to testify against Hale. This was the turning point the federal investigators had been working toward. The man who stood inside the family structure was now prepared to describe what had happened from within it. Ernest's testimony did not erase the suffering of the victims. It did not restore the lives that had been taken, but it gave investigators something they had been missing: a direct connection between the people who had benefited from the deaths and the people who carried them out. John Ramsey emerged as one of the key figures in the violent side of the operation. According to the federal investigation, Ramsey was directly involved in multiple killings, including the murder of Henry Roan and the deaths connected to the Smith family. Hale, investigators believed, occupied the position of organizer and beneficiary. Ramsey could carry out violence. Ernest provided a link between the family and Hale's plans. Other participants, including Brian Burkhart and Kelsey Morrison, were connected to individual crimes. The network was becoming visible. The deaths were no longer isolated incidents. They were connected through people, money, inheritance, and instructions. But there remained a crucial question. Could the government prove the conspiracy in court? Hale had spent years building influence. His defense could challenge witnesses, attack their credibility, and exploit every weakness in the evidence. Ernest himself had already demonstrated how vulnerable the prosecution could be when a key witness changed his testimony. The case therefore moved toward trial under enormous pressure. The government had a story to tell, but it needed to turn that story into admissible evidence. It needed to show that Henry Roan's death was not simply a murder without an identifiable motive, but a crime connected to Hale. It needed to establish the significance of the insurance policy. It needed to demonstrate the role of Ramsey and the connections among the people involved. Most importantly, it needed to overcome the shadow of fear that had protected the suspected network for so long. Ernest Burkhart had finally stepped across that line. He was no longer simply Hale's nephew or Molly's husband. He had become a witness against the man who had stood at the center of the investigation. And once Ernest decided to speak again, the government finally possessed the testimony needed to take the case toward its decisive confrontation. The courtroom. By the time William K. Hale was brought into the federal justice system, the case against him had become far larger than the death of a single man. Behind the indictment stood years of suspicious deaths, shattered families, valuable Osage head rights, and a community that had struggled to obtain answers. Yet the government could not simply place the entire history of the Osage murders before a jury and expect a conviction. The law required something more precise. Investigators and prosecutors had to connect Hale to a specific crime with evidence strong enough to survive the courtroom. The murder that ultimately became the foundation of the case was the killing of Henry Roan. On January 26, 1923, Roan, an Osage man and relative of Molly Burkhart's family, was shot and killed. He was found in his vehicle. His death had already been disturbing on its own, but the discovery that William Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on Roan created a financial connection that investigators could not easily ignore. Hale had a documented economic interest connected to the death of the man. Roan's murder also occurred within an area under federal jurisdiction, giving the federal government a legal basis to prosecute. That distinction became critical. The government did not have to prove every suspicious death surrounding the Osage community in order to bring Hale before a federal court. It could focus on the crime for which federal jurisdiction provided a clear path. On January 9, 1926, William Hale and John Ramsey were indicted federally in connection with the murder of Henry Roan. The indictment represented a major development, but it did not mean that Hale's power had suddenly disappeared. For years, he had cultivated influence throughout Osage County. He had established relationships with businesses, banks, and local figures. He had presented himself as a respected and generous man. Now that reputation stood in opposition to the accusations being made against him. The government's case, therefore, had to overcome more than questions about the murder itself. It had to challenge the public image of a man who had spent years making himself difficult to confront. John Ramsey represented a very different problem. He was connected directly to the violent side of the alleged conspiracy. Federal investigators identified him as being involved in multiple killings, including the murder of Henry Roan and the deaths associated with the Smith family. If Hale was the organizer investigators believed him to be, Ramsey represented the person willing to carry out the violence. The prosecution, therefore, had to establish a connection between the two men. It was not enough to show that Ramsey had committed a killing. It was necessary to demonstrate the relationship between Ramsey's actions and Hale's alleged plans. This was where the federal investigation's work became particularly important. Investigators had not simply collected evidence from one crime scene. They had spent time penetrating a community where fear had made witnesses reluctant to speak. They had followed the relationships surrounding the victims. They had examined the financial motives created by head rights and inheritance. They had identified people connected to individual murders. And, most importantly, they had obtained information from Ernest Burkhart. Ernest's position made his testimony unusually important. He was Hale's nephew and Molly Burkhart's husband. He was therefore connected to both the suspected organizer and the family that had suffered repeated deaths. His statements helped investigators connect Hale with Ramsey and other participants. But Ernest was not a perfectly stable witness. The pressure surrounding him became obvious during the legal proceedings. According to the federal investigation, while Ernest was preparing to testify, he was taken from the court to Hale's ranch during an effort by the defense to influence him. The following day, Ernest appeared and withdrew part of what he had previously told investigators. For the prosecution, the development threatened to weaken one of its most important connections to Hale. A witness who had helped reveal the alleged conspiracy was now retreating. The defense could use that change to challenge his credibility. If Ernest could change his account once, the defense could ask, why should a jury believe anything he said? This was one of the central difficulties in the prosecution. The government was dealing with a suspected conspiracy that had operated through relationships and secrecy. Much of what happened had not been witnessed publicly. The people who knew the most were also people who could incriminate themselves. Ernest was an example of that problem. His knowledge came at a personal cost. He was not simply describing someone else's actions. He was acknowledging his own involvement. That made his testimony both valuable and vulnerable. Yet Ernest ultimately changed his decision again. He accepted responsibility for his role in the conspiracy and admitted involvement in the plan that included the bombing that killed Rita Smith and William Smith. He then agreed to testify against Hale. His decision strengthened the government's case by providing investigators with an insider who could describe the relationships among the people involved. The prosecution could now present a connection between Hale and Ramsey that was more substantial than suspicion alone. It could also explain why the deaths mattered financially. The head rights were the underlying source of wealth. Inheritance determined where that wealth could go. The deaths changed the inheritance structure. And Hale's relationship with Ernest placed him close to a family whose property could eventually benefit the men around him. The case surrounding Henry Roan was especially important because of the life insurance policy. The $25,000 policy showed that Hale had a direct financial interest associated with Roan. It gave prosecutors something concrete to place before the court. The alleged conspiracy was not simply about a vague desire for Osage wealth. There was evidence of a specific financial arrangement involving Hale and a victim who had been murdered. Yet the government faced another challenge. Hale was not being tried for every death associated with the broader reign of terror. He was being prosecuted in connection with Henry Roan. This distinction would remain important throughout the legal history of the case. The investigators believed that the conspiracy extended far beyond one victim. The Osage Nation and later historical accounts associated the period with dozens of suspicious deaths. But a courtroom required the government to prove individual criminal responsibility according to the charges brought. This meant that many deaths could remain outside the final judgment even if investigators believed they belonged to the same network. The trial process, therefore, became a battle over what could actually be demonstrated. The prosecution had the financial motive, the insurance policy, the testimony of people connected to the conspiracy, and the broader pattern of deaths. The defense had the opportunity to challenge witnesses and weaken the connections among the alleged participants. Hale's influence remained a factor in the atmosphere surrounding the proceedings. The case went through legal complications, including changes in the location of proceedings, difficulties involving juries, and efforts to weaken the prosecution's witnesses. At different stages, the government did not receive the straightforward result it wanted. The legal process demonstrated how difficult it was to transform years of suspicion into a criminal conviction. The Osage community had lived with the consequences of the deaths for years. The government had finally entered the case, but the courtroom could not simply repair all that had been lost. Every witness who testified carried the weight of people who were no longer alive to speak for themselves. Every piece of evidence represented only one fragment of a much larger tragedy. And every legal decision raised the same fundamental question: could the government prove that the man known as the King of the Osage Hills had used his influence and his family connections to turn murder into financial gain? For Hale, the stakes were enormous. A conviction would destroy the public identity he had constructed and place him in federal prison. For Ernest, the stakes were equally personal. By testifying against his uncle, he was admitting his own participation and exposing the man who had influenced him. For Molly, the proceedings represented something even more painful. The people she had lost could not return, regardless of what the court decided. Anna was gone. Rita was gone. Other members of her family were gone. She herself had survived a suspected poisoning attempt. The courtroom could establish responsibility, but it could not restore the family that had been taken from her. As the case moved forward, the government's evidence increasingly centered on the connection between Hale, Ramsey, and Ernest. The alleged structure of the conspiracy was becoming clearer. Hale stood behind the plan. Ramsey participated in the violence. Ernest was connected through family and inheritance and ultimately became a witness for the government. The prosecution did not need to prove every suspected murder in Oklahoma. It needed to convince the court that Hale was responsible for Henry Roan's death. That distinction would define the outcome. The long investigation had finally reached its most consequential stage. After years in which the Osage community had watched deaths go unexplained, federal prosecutors were asking a jury to believe that one of the most powerful men in the region was not merely a wealthy rancher or businessman, but the organizer of a murder committed for financial gain. The courtroom would determine whether the evidence was enough. And when the legal battle finally reached its conclusion, William Hale would no longer be known only as the influential king of the Osage Hills. He would be a convicted participant in one of the most notorious murder conspiracies in American history. The conviction of William K. Hale marked a major turning point in the Osage murders, but it did not bring the entire story to a close. For years, the deaths had seemed to disappear into separate explanations, separate investigations, and separate tragedies. Now, at least one of the people believed to be at the center of the conspiracy had been held criminally responsible. Yet the legal victory was narrower than the scale of the tragedy. Hale was not convicted for every death investigators associated with the so-called reign of terror. He was convicted in connection with the murder of Henry Roan. That distinction is essential because the historical record surrounding the Osage murders contains a much larger number of suspicious and unresolved deaths than the crimes for which specific individuals ultimately receive convictions. The federal investigation had uncovered a network that appeared to extend beyond a single killing. But the justice system could only punish what prosecutors were able to prove in court. Henry Roan became the case that could be taken across that legal threshold. Roan was an Osage man and relative of Molly Burkhart's family. On January 26, 1923, he was shot and killed and found in his vehicle. The financial connection to William Hale was especially important. Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on Roan. That policy gave investigators a direct and documented financial relationship between Hale and the victim. It did not, by itself, explain every aspect of the larger conspiracy, but it provided a concrete fact around which prosecutors could build their case. The murder had also taken place in territory under federal jurisdiction, which created the legal basis for federal prosecution. The significance of the case extended beyond the identity of the victim. Roan's death demonstrated how financial interests could exist alongside violence. The Osage headright system had already created a situation in which inheritance could transfer enormous wealth after a death. The insurance policy added another possible financial benefit. For investigators, these connections reinforced the theory that money was not merely present somewhere in the background. It could be directly associated with the people being killed. William Hale had spent years building a reputation as a powerful and respected figure. He was a ranch owner, businessman, and influential member of the local community. He had relationships with banks and stores and had cultivated an image of generosity and friendliness toward the Osage. Now prosecutors had to persuade the court that this public image concealed something far darker. According to the federal investigation, Hale had used money, threats, bribery, and personal relationships with local officials to maintain his influence. The alleged conspiracy depended upon that influence because murder was only one part of the process. The other parts involved access, inheritance, and the movement of property. Hale did not necessarily need to carry out the violence himself. Investigators believed that he could rely on other people to perform that role. John Ramsey was one of the most important of those people. Ramsey was identified as being directly involved in multiple killings, including Henry Roan and the deaths connected to the Smith family. In the structure described by investigators, Hale was the organizer and Ramsey was one of the men willing to commit the violence. Ernest Burkhart occupied another position within the network. He was Hale's nephew and Molly's husband. His relationship with Molly connected him directly to the family whose wealth and headrights appeared to be at the center of the alleged scheme. His role became especially significant because he eventually turned against Hale. Ernest's cooperation had not been straightforward. He had first provided information that helped connect Hale to Ramsey and other participants. But during the legal proceedings, he came under pressure. According to the information gathered by the federal investigation, Ernest was taken from court to Hale's ranch while the defense was attempting to influence him. The next day, Ernest withdrew part of his earlier account. The episode demonstrated the difficulties prosecutors faced. A key witness had changed his story, and that change could have damaged the government's attempt to establish Hale's responsibility. Yet Ernest eventually changed his position again. He accepted responsibility for his own role in the conspiracy and acknowledged his involvement in the bombing that killed Rita Smith and William Smith. He then agreed to testify against Hale. His decision gave the prosecution an important insider perspective. Ernest could help explain the relationships connecting Hale to the people involved in the murders. He could help investigators move from a collection of suspicious deaths toward a specific account of how the alleged conspiracy functioned. But his testimony also carried an uncomfortable truth. The people who helped expose the conspiracy were not necessarily innocent observers. Some had participated. Ernest himself had been part of the alleged scheme. His eventual cooperation did not erase that involvement. It demonstrated instead how complicated the case had become. The prosecution was trying to dismantle a network in which family relationships, financial interests, and criminal actions were intertwined. The case also involved Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother. Brian was connected to the killing of Anna Brown, while Kelsey Morrison admitted participating in Anna's murder. Federal investigators believed Anna's killing had been carried out under Hale's direction. These connections gave the broader investigation greater weight, but they did not automatically become separate convictions against Hale for every death. That limitation would remain one of the most significant aspects of the final outcome. William Hale was eventually convicted in connection with Henry Roan's murder. In January 1929, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to the federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas. John Ramsey also received a life sentence. Ernest Burkhart was likewise sentenced to life imprisonment for his role. The convictions represented a major legal achievement, particularly given the power and influence surrounding the case. A man who had once been known as the King of the Osage Hills was now a federal prisoner. The network that investigators believed had protected him had been penetrated. The testimony of participants had become evidence against the people who had benefited from the deaths. Yet the sentences could not answer every question left behind by the years of violence. Hale had not been convicted for every person investigators believed he was responsible for killing. The federal case centered on Henry Roan. The broader Reign of Terror involved far more deaths. The Osage Nation reported that Hale and people associated with him were suspected of connections to more than 20 killings. Other historical accounts have placed the number of suspicious or unresolved deaths during the period at more than 60. These figures should not be treated as a single confirmed victim count for one conspiracy, because the cases differed and many were never resolved through criminal convictions. But the scale of the uncertainty itself is significant. Dozens of lives had been lost during a period when Osage wealth had become extraordinarily valuable. Many families were left without answers, and many suspected crimes never reached the same legal conclusion as the Roan murder. This meant that the convictions provided only partial justice. They established criminal responsibility in specific cases, but they could not provide a definitive legal explanation for every death that had occurred during the period. Some victims had died under circumstances that remained unclear. Some suspected participants were never brought to court for the full range of crimes investigators associated with them, and some families had to continue living with the knowledge that the deaths of their relatives might never receive a formal judgment. This limitation is particularly important when considering the history of the Osage murders. It is tempting to view Hale's conviction as the moment when the entire mystery was solved. It was not. The government had proved enough to secure convictions, but not enough to transform every suspicious death into an established murder case. The difference between suspicion and proof remained. The case therefore ended with both an achievement and a failure. The achievement was that Hale, Ramsey, and Ernest were ultimately punished for their roles. The failure was that the legal system could not account for the full scale of the suffering experienced by the Osage community. Even after the convictions, the consequences of the murders continued. Hale and the other convicted men remained imprisoned for years. Eventually, Hale and the other men were paroled in 1947. After approximately 18 years of imprisonment, Ernest Burkhart's story continued even longer. He was later pardoned by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman in 1965. Molly's life also moved forward, though nothing could erase the losses she had endured. She divorced Ernest and later remarried. She died in 1933 at the age of 54. Her survival meant that the alleged effort to eliminate her had failed. But survival did not mean escape from the consequences of the years of violence. The courtroom had established a measure of accountability, but it could not return Anna, Rita, Henry, Bill, Nettie, Minnie, Lizzie, or the other people whose deaths remain part of the larger history. The Osage murders therefore left behind an uncomfortable lesson about the limits of justice. A conviction can identify a criminal, It can impose punishment. It can establish responsibility for a particular crime. But it cannot automatically restore everything that was destroyed. In the Osage case, the deeper tragedy was that the killings had been connected to a system of inheritance and wealth that made human lives appear to some people as obstacles to financial gain. The federal investigation had exposed that system, but the legal process could address only a portion of what had happened. The final judgment against Hale was therefore significant, but incomplete. It closed one courtroom chapter, while leaving many questions outside the reach of a verdict. For the Osage families who had lost loved ones, the most important question was not simply whether William Hale had been punished. It was whether the country had finally understood what had happened to them, and whether the laws and institutions that had failed to protect them would change as a result. The convictions of William K. Hale, John Ramsey, and Ernest Burkhart brought an important measure of accountability, but they did not erase the years of fear that had preceded them. For the Osage community, the murders had exposed something deeper than the actions of a few individuals. They had revealed how extraordinary wealth, an inheritance system, discrimination, and local influence could combine to leave an entire community vulnerable. The tragedy was not only that people had been murdered, it was that so many deaths could occur before the full pattern became visible, and that even after investigators uncovered the conspiracy, the justice system could address only part of what had happened. William Hale had been convicted in connection with Henry Roan's murder, but the broader history contained many more suspicious deaths. Investigators believed Hale was responsible for more than the single killing for which he was ultimately prosecuted. The Osage Nation associated Hale and people connected to him with more than 20 suspected killings. While historical accounts of the wider period have identified more than 60 Osage people who died or disappeared under suspicious or unresolved circumstances between roughly 1920 and 1925. These numbers must be understood carefully. They do not mean that every one of those deaths was legally proven to be part of Hale's conspiracy. Many never resulted in a criminal conviction. But the scale of the unresolved deaths remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the story. A conviction could establish responsibility for one murder. It could not automatically explain every unexplained death that had occurred during the same period. For the families of those victims, that distinction mattered. The courtroom had produced a judgment, but it could not produce answers for every family. It could not identify every person who might have participated in the violence. It could not reconstruct every decision that had been made behind closed doors. And it could not return the people who had been lost. The story of Molly Burkhart illustrates this limitation particularly clearly. Molly had survived the deaths of members of her family, including Minnie, Anna, Lizzie, and Rita. She had also survived the suspected attempt to poison her. Her marriage to Ernest had placed her directly within the network surrounding Hale, and the later investigation revealed that the person closest to her could also be connected to the alleged conspiracy. Yet Molly herself lived beyond the period of the investigation. She divorced Ernest and later remarried. She died in 1933 at the age of 54. Her life after the murders was therefore not simply a continuation of the case. It was a life lived after enormous loss. Her survival could not restore her sisters or her mother. It could not erase the knowledge that her own life had apparently been placed at risk because of the wealth associated with her family. It could not undo the destruction of the Smith household or the death of Nettie Brookshire, who had no role in the inheritance that made Rita valuable but nevertheless died in the bombing. The victims were not numbers in an inheritance calculation. They were members of families, and every death created another absence. The headright system had been created to provide Osage people with a continuing share of the mineral wealth beneath their lands. But its inheritance rules created a vulnerability that outsiders could exploit. A valuable headright could survive its owner. That meant that someone who wanted the wealth did not necessarily need to take it by force. They could wait for death to transfer it. When combined with marriage, the system created another possibility. An outsider could become connected to an Osage family and potentially become an heir. in the alleged scheme surrounding Hale. Investigators believed that this principle was manipulated deliberately. Ernest's marriage to Molly became significant because he could potentially benefit from the deaths of people in her family. Hale could potentially benefit through Ernest. The structure was chilling precisely because the violence was connected to ordinary legal mechanisms. Marriage created relationships. Death triggered inheritance. Inheritance transferred property. But according to investigators, murder was inserted into that process. What should have been a system for transferring family wealth became, in the hands of criminals, part of a method for acquiring it. The federal government eventually responded to the wider problem. In 1925, Congress passed legislation restricting the ability of people who were not Osage to inherit head rights from Osage individuals who had more than one-half Osage blood. The purpose was to prevent the same vulnerability from continuing. The measure reflected an important realization. Protecting the Osage required more than prosecuting individual killers. The legal structure surrounding inheritance itself needed greater protection. The government had to recognize that enormous wealth could attract people who were prepared to manipulate family relationships and exploit legal rights for personal gain. Yet legislation could not undo the deaths that had already occurred, nor could it immediately repair the distrust created by years of unexplained violence. The investigation itself also left an important mark on federal law enforcement. The Bureau of Investigation, predecessor of the FBI, had faced an unusual challenge in Oklahoma. Traditional methods were not sufficient because the suspected network operated within a community where fear and influence could interfere with testimony. Tom White and his investigators therefore relied on undercover work. Agents entered the community under different identities, including insurance representatives, cattle buyers, oil prospectors, and doctors or medical practitioners. Their purpose was to gather information without revealing the true nature of the investigation. This approach allowed them to penetrate the environment surrounding the deaths and gradually identify connections that were difficult to see from the outside. The investigation became an important example of how federal agents could use secrecy, witness cooperation, financial information, and relationships to build a case against people who appeared protected by local power. Ernest Burkhart became particularly important because he represented the connection between the two worlds at the heart of the case. He was Hale's nephew, but he was also Molly's husband. He had knowledge of the alleged plans, and his eventual decision to cooperate helped investigators connect Hale to John Ramsey and other participants. Yet Ernest's own history also demonstrated how complicated the pursuit of justice could become. He had participated in the conspiracy and was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment. His cooperation did not make him an innocent witness. Instead, it showed how a person involved in a crime could become essential to exposing the person who stood above him. Ernest's testimony helped establish the connection between Hale and the alleged killings. But it came only after he had struggled with the consequences of telling the truth. He had even withdrawn part of his earlier statements before ultimately deciding to accept responsibility and testify against his uncle. His story, therefore, became another reminder that the investigation was not simply a battle between good and evil. It involved people making choices under pressure, some of whom had already contributed to the suffering of others. John Ramsey's role was different. He was identified as one of the people directly involved in the violence. Investigators connected him to the murder of Henry Roan and to the killings associated with the Smith family. He eventually received a life sentence. His conviction represented another link in the chain between the alleged organizer and the physical acts of murder. But even Ramsey's punishment could not account for every suspicious death. The legal outcomes remained narrower than the historical tragedy. Hale and the others were eventually paroled in 1947 after approximately 18 years of imprisonment. Ernest Burkhart was later pardoned by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman in 1965. Their release did not alter the fundamental history of what had happened. The people they had been convicted of harming remained dead. The wealth that had motivated the crimes could not compensate the families for their losses. And the years of fear could not simply be removed from memory. The legacy of the Osage murders therefore extends beyond the courtroom. The case demonstrates how prejudice can make victims more vulnerable when institutions fail to protect them equally. It demonstrates how corruption can thrive when local power is allowed to operate without sufficient scrutiny. It demonstrates how financial systems that appear neutral can become dangerous when individuals are willing to manipulate them. Most importantly, it demonstrates the human cost of treating wealth as more important than life. The people who were murdered were not merely owners of valuable head rights. They were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers. Anna Brown was not simply a valuable inheritance. Rita Smith was not simply a headright holder. Henry Roan was not simply the subject of an insurance policy. Each had a life that existed independently of the money others wanted to obtain. The investigation eventually revealed enough of the truth to convict key figures. But it could not provide complete justice for everyone. That incompleteness is part of the historical record and should not be hidden. The Osage murders were solved only in part. Some victims received recognition through convictions. Others remained connected to deaths that never reached a courtroom. The Reign of Terror, therefore, remains a story not only about a criminal conspiracy, but about the consequences of a society in which vulnerable people could be surrounded by immense wealth and still struggle to obtain protection. The final question is not simply how Hale and his associates were caught. It is why so many people had to die before anyone was able or willing to see the pattern. The answer lies in the intersection of money, inheritance, prejudice, fear, and power. And that is why the Osage murders remain one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. The story of the Osage murders does not end with a prison sentence. It does not end when William K. Hale was taken to Leavenworth, Kansas, or when John Ramsey and Ernest Burkhart received life sentences. Those convictions were important, but they represented only one part of a much larger tragedy. The deeper story is about what happened when enormous wealth entered a community that had already faced discrimination, and how that wealth created an opportunity for people willing to exploit the most intimate structures of human life: family, marriage, inheritance, and trust. The Osage people had become wealthy because of the oil beneath their land. Their head rights gave them a continuing share of the mineral revenue, and that wealth changed their circumstances dramatically. But prosperity did not make them safe. Instead, their wealth attracted people who saw their lives through the lens of financial opportunity. The deaths that followed revealed how dangerous that could become. Minnie Kyle died in 1918 at approximately 27 years of age after an illness that was not initially treated as suspicious. Anna Brown was found dead in 1921, shot in the back of the head. Lizzie Q died only months later. Henry Roan was shot in 1923, and the discovery that William Hale had purchased a $25,000 life insurance policy on him became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the federal case. Then Rita Smith, William Bill Smith, and Nettie Brookshire died when a bomb destroyed the Smith home. Molly Burkhart, surrounded by loss, eventually suspected that she herself was being poisoned. Each death carried its own grief. Together, they formed something much larger. They revealed a system in which death could cause property to move from one person to another. The financial mechanism was simple. A person possessed a head right. That person died. The head right could be inherited. The beneficiary gained control of wealth that had previously belonged to the victim. If another person stood to inherit after that beneficiary died, another death could potentially produce another transfer. The alleged conspiracy surrounding Hale exploited precisely this structure. According to investigators, Hale encouraged his nephew Ernest Burkhart to marry Molly. If members of Molly's family died, Ernest could potentially become an heir. Hale could then potentially benefit through his nephew. The alleged plan therefore transformed ordinary family relationships into a financial pathway. It is difficult to imagine a more disturbing corruption of trust. Marriage, which should have represented companionship and protection, became part of the alleged strategy. Inheritance, which should have preserved family wealth, became a possible mechanism for transferring it to outsiders. And death, which should have marked the end of a life, became the event from which the perpetrators could profit. This was what made the Osage murders different from a conventional series of crimes. The alleged objective was not simply to kill. It was to kill in a way that produced financial consequences. The violence, therefore, had an economic structure beneath it. William Hale became the central figure in the federal investigation. He had arrived in Oklahoma around 1902 with relatively little money and eventually became a wealthy rancher. Businessman, an influential local figure. He cultivated relationships and built a public reputation as a generous and friendly man. He became known as the King of the Osage Hills. But federal investigators eventually believed that his influence concealed a criminal network. They connected him to John Ramsey and other participants and believed he had directed murders for financial gain. Ernest Burkhart became the crucial link. He was Hale's nephew and Molly's husband. He had participated in the conspiracy but ultimately cooperated with investigators. His decision to testify was not simple. He had first provided information connecting Hale to Ramsey and others, then came under pressure and withdrew part of his earlier statements. According to the federal investigation, he was taken from court to Hale's ranch during an effort to influence him. Yet Ernest eventually changed his decision again. He accepted responsibility for his own role and testified against his uncle. His testimony helped transform the investigation. The federal agents, led by Tom White, had already spent years working through a wall of fear. They had entered the community undercover, posing as insurance agents, cattle buyers, oil prospectors, and medical practitioners. Their objective was to gather information without alerting Hale or his associates. The strategy reflected the difficulty of investigating crimes in an environment where local influence could prevent witnesses from speaking freely. The investigation eventually produced convictions, but the legal result was narrower than the historical tragedy. Hale was convicted for his role in the murder of Henry Roan. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in January 1929 and sent to Leavenworth. John Ramsey also received life imprisonment. Ernest Burkhart was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role. These outcomes demonstrated that the federal government could successfully prosecute powerful figures when local systems had failed to provide effective answers. But they did not establish criminal responsibility for every death associated with the wider reign of terror. This distinction must remain clear. Hale was not convicted for dozens of murders. The federal prosecution centered on Henry Roan. Investigators believed Hale was connected to many other deaths, and the Osage Nation has associated him and people around him with more than 20 suspected killings. Historical accounts have also identified more than 60 Osage people who died or disappeared under suspicious or unresolved circumstances during the early 1920s. But many of those deaths never resulted in a criminal verdict. That means the historical record contains a painful gap between suspicion and legal proof. Some families received answers through convictions. Others did not. Some suspected perpetrators were identified. Others were never brought to justice for the deaths connected to them. That incompleteness is essential to understanding the case honestly. It would be easier to tell the story as though the federal investigation arrived, discovered the truth, arrested Hale, and solved everything. But that would erase the experiences of the people who remain without answers. The investigation brought justice in specific cases, not complete justice for the entire community. The government did take steps to address the vulnerability created by the headright system. In 1925, Congress passed legislation restricting the ability of non-Osage people to inherit headrights from Osage individuals who had more than one-half Osage blood. The goal was to reduce the possibility that outsiders could continue exploiting inheritance in the same way. The legislation reflected an important recognition. The danger was not only individual criminals. The structure itself had created an opportunity that could be abused. But no law could restore the people who had already died. No reform could return Anna to her family, bring Rita and Bill Smith back to their home, or erase the death of Nettie Brookshire. No legal change could undo the suffering experienced by Molly after watching so many members of her family disappear. Molly later divorced Ernest and remarried. She died in 1933 at the age of 54. Her life, after the investigation, reminds us that surviving a murder conspiracy does not mean escaping its consequences. The victims and survivors carried the story long after the court proceedings ended. Hale and the other convicted men were eventually paroled in 1947 after approximately 18 years in prison. Ernest was later pardoned by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman in 1965. Their eventual release is another reminder that the legal system has its own timeline, one that can continue long after the immediate public attention has disappeared. But for the families of the victims, the central fact never changed. The people they had lost did not return. The legacy of the Osage murders is therefore not simply a lesson about one criminal named William Hale. It is a warning about what can happen when wealth, prejudice, and unchecked influence intersect. The case demonstrates that murder can be hidden not only through physical concealment, but through social structures. A death can be disguised as illness. A crime can be treated as an isolated event. A powerful person can appear respectable. A financial transfer can look perfectly legal. And when each individual piece is examined separately, the larger pattern can remain invisible. The federal investigators succeeded because they eventually examined the connections between those pieces. They asked not only how people died, but what happened to their property afterward. They examined not only the victims, but the people who stood to benefit. They looked beyond individual crime scenes and into relationships, inheritance, and money. That approach transformed the case. But the most enduring lesson is human rather than investigative. The Osage people were not targets because they were abstract owners of valuable property. They were targeted because other people wanted what belonged to them. Their wealth became more important to the perpetrators than their lives. The tragedy lies in that reversal of values. A head right is a legal right. An inheritance is a financial process. An insurance policy is a contract. A marriage is a personal relationship. None of these things should have been instruments of death. Yet in the alleged conspiracy surrounding William Hale, they became interconnected parts of a system designed to benefit from human loss. That is why the Osage murders remain so disturbing. The horror is not contained in one gunshot, one bomb, or one suspicious illness. It is found in the pattern: a family loses a member, property moves, another person dies, and the process repeats. The people behind the conspiracy could calculate what a death was worth. The victims could not. For them, there was no calculation, only a life interrupted, a family broken, and a community forced to ask why so many of its people were disappearing. The Reign of Terror eventually became a story that could be investigated, prosecuted, and remembered. But remembering must include the limits of what was proven. Hale's conviction was real. Ramsey's conviction was real. Ernest's participation and later cooperation were real. The reforms that followed were real. But the full number of victims and the complete scope of every suspected killing could never be captured by those courtroom outcomes alone. That is why the final measure of this history cannot be the length of a prison sentence. It must be the memory of the people whose lives were reduced by others to the value of their property. The Osage murders began with wealth beneath the ground, but the deepest story was always about the value placed on human life. The oil created extraordinary fortunes. The headrights created a path for that wealth to be inherited. Greed transformed that inheritance into motive. Fear allowed the violence to continue. And persistence finally brought some of the truth into the light. The story ends not with the claim that justice was complete, but with the recognition that justice was necessary and that remembering the victims remains part of it.